Hello and welcome to Post Games, a podcast about how and why we love video games. I am your host, Christopher Thomas Plant, and I am so happy to have you here. Now, earlier this year, I spoke with Hot Pink, who is a creator of sexy, lewd video games. At that time, if you remember, not safe for work games ranging from raunchy action adventures to these hardcore pornographic sexcapades. They had achieved historic levels of popularity and availability. You could find them pretty much anywhere, and they were appealing to every spot on the sexual spectrum. But where I saw sunny skies, Hot Pink warned me of a huge rainstorm that could wash away this entire parade at any moment. These platforms had policies that allowed games to be published on their service, but they were pretty easy to poke holes in. To not safe for work game creators, the platforms felt less like permanent homes and more like temporary, shacks, hideouts, shelters that could be knocked down with the slightest puff of wind. Well, that wind came. This isn't, to be clear, the end of not safe for work games, nor is it the end of these campaigns to abolish them. I am producing this episode when the coin of fate has flipped into the air and we are waiting to see which side it will land on. Both sides of the censorship battle are hoping that they can influence that coin just a little more in their favor. To help us understand what changed over the past few months and what it means for the future of sexy video games and video game censorship, I needed an expert on, media censorship, video games, pornography, feminism, and the history of sex labor activism. And I found that person. Jean Ketterling, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. This week on Post Games, the movement to censor sexy games. Act 1, the summer the sexy games got banned. Act 2, the future fight against censorship. A Patreon bonus, Ketterling sticks around so that we can talk about the Gooner contingency discourse, and she shares a few not safe for work game recs if you are the sort of person who, reads the magazine for the articles. Act 3, the news of the week, and a extra Patreon bonus, what I saw at Sega headquarters this week. I can't wait to share it with you. But first, we have a great interview ahead, so let's get right to it. Act 1. The summer sexy games got banned. Jean Ketterling takes sexy video games seriously. The assistant professor, researcher, and writer holds a PhD in legal studies from Carleton University in Ottawa. Along with her role as assistant professor at Saskatchewan, Ketterling serves as the communications officer for the Sexuality Studies Association and the vice president of the Canadian Game Studies Association. She has published multiple papers and pieces on the intersection of sex, gender, feminism, and video games. In her own words, she is interested in sexual video games and, quote, how they represent sex, their ability to make space for experimental sexual play, and how sexual content in video games is promoted, controlled, and regulated by platforms. Relevant to today. Here we go. You have studied sex in video games for many years. You've written several papers on the topics of gender and sex. What do you find interesting about this corner of entertainment?
Yeah, a lot. I find a lot really interesting about it. I think to talk a little bit, my dissertation was on how indie video games and indie video game makers are using video games as a medium to express something about sex and sexuality. So in other words, indie video games are not representing sex like film or video pornography is, right? They're using a different set of techniques to represent sex. And I think what's so interesting about that, right, is it's pushing back on some of the ways we conventionally think about sex and porn. So we tend to think about porn in this way that's all about the visual. It's about realism. It's about graphic penetration. It's about all this sort of like very explicit kind of stuff that's all about the eye and about the visual. and what video games are doing in relation to sex and representing sex is interesting because often, especially indie developers, they don't have the capacity to represent sex in those ways necessarily, right? So they're having to get creative. They're thinking about sound, they're thinking about touch, they're thinking about rhythm, and they're thinking about all these other sort of mechanical ways of exploring sex that I think stretch the way we can think about pornography in this current moment, as well as think about how we think about sex, right?
Do you have a game that comes to mind as a key example of this, where it really differentiates itself from what we see in film or elsewhere?
I have a whole dissertation that will hopefully be a book in 2 to 3 years. But yeah, in that work, I look at examples like La Petite Mort and Luxuria Superbia around touch and sex, right? I look at a game called NSFW about rhythm. And yeah, so things like that. Robert Yang's games always come up in these conversations, right? His work is so important to the field. But yeah, those types of games.
For people who might not be familiar with Robert's work, can you give a description of what happens in his game?
Yeah, I mean, his work is so interesting for a lot of reasons, and for the conversation around regulation as well. So I'm thinking about the Tea Room, right, which is a historical bathroom simulator where you learn the embodied codes of cruising to then have oral sex in a bathroom, except again, then he layers these additional meanings on it where all the penises are guns, right, as a commentary on violence and sex in games and the regulation of those two themes. This is all, again, inspired by a police sting that happened in Ohio, right, where the police hid in the bathroom behind a fake wall and arrested men for cruising. Like, there's layers and layers of meaning there. But his games are really wide and varied in terms of the stuff they talk about. But I think all of them are in some way about the regulation of sex on the internet or in the world. He has spoken a lot about the way in which his games tend to be banned, tend to be deemed obscene in certain ways, whereas other games don't. So he has spoken before about how he's the most banned developer on Twitch, but like The Witcher or other games that have sex in them are not. No one cares about that, but his sort of gay sex games or his games about gay sex tend to be banned. And
so in June, I interviewed the lewd game maker Hot Pink about how sexy games have become ubiquitous on platforms. And at that time, it felt to me, honestly, like not safe for work games weren't just like available, but they were thriving. And it was unusual compared to the history of video games. Before we get into recent events, what led to the past few years of a kind of a relative hands-off approach to digital retailers platforming lewd games?
I wish I knew. So like it's so interesting, right? So just to maybe back up a little bit, as you covered in that episode, we have this whole history in which porn games, sex games, lewd games, however you want to call them, which is also an interesting question, but whatever we want to call these games, the whole history, at least in North America, of governing these games was squeezing the space that they had to be available, to be published, to be distributed, right? And then in 2018, we have this moment in the internet too, right, with the passing of Sesta Fosta, where like the space for sex on the internet was constrained in meaningful ways. We see Tumblr come down, Backpages, all these other platforms are more than ever governing in this risk-focused way, right? So they start to pull sexual content down off the internet. Like in that moment, Steam decides to open its platform up to pornography, right? So in 2018, they changed their governance rules or their policies to do this like infamous sort of anything goes policy, right? And they've been fine-tuning it ever since. But I think we had this couple of years where it felt like video game platforms were flying under the radar a little bit, right? So we had in the internet more broadly, increased scrutiny, increased deplatformization of these games. And then all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden again, but what we have is why are video game platforms, quote unquote, resilient to that? And I don't know. The answer to that is I don't know, and I'd love to find out. Like partially because platforms aren't talking to us about why they're making these decisions necessarily. At the time, Steam did publish a blog that articulated the importance of diverse sexual expression to some extent. But that's really all we got, as far as I know. So we don't really know, which is part of then what is part of the problem about what's happening now as well is that platform governance, whether it's permissive or whether it's restrictive, is really opaque.
Let's catch people up on the trouble, I guess, that's going on. Can you catch up the audience on what has happened over the course of the summer?
Yeah. No,
That's a big question.
It is. And I feel like there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, I maybe want to come back to what you just said, which is that, exactly, these developers seem to be living in the glory days. There was this explosion of content, right? You can see it in the number of games, like relative to the total Steam releases. Like there is this upwards trajectory of sex games. What we're experiencing now is a backlash to that. I think part of it is that this new wave of regulation is in some way directly related to the success of those games. But okay, so what's happened? It's complicated and layered, but what I would say is Collective Shout, a relatively conservative feminist Australian anti-porn organization, has been advocating for Steam to take down a game called No Mercy, which we could talk about because folks aren't talking about that game, and we could talk about it if you want. But as a result of that, they didn't get the response they wanted from Steam. And so they started targeting payment processors with that advocacy campaign, which involved an open letter as well as a call for their members or supporters to write letters or to email payment processors directly. And so what is important about this, I think, is that this is a really well-trodden playbook. Collective Shout has said that they didn't anticipate what happened next. And whether or not that's true, we've seen this be a tactic that other groups, anti-porn groups, have used to deplatform porn. So they go after the payment processors, who then go to the platforms, who then have to enact a set of changes that are really about what the payment processors want in order to manage their own set of risks, right? And so what this looks like is like no non-consensual content, either real or fantasy, no content involving animals, no content involving, I'd have to get the list up, but it often stuff like intoxication gets, again, real or fantasy gets brought up in that list. And so these are lists that happen often. So my colleague Val Weber has looked at the way in which that happened for camming as well. And the list of prohibited content is almost identical. So all of that to say, this is a really well-trodden playbook. And so then Itch and Steam pull down some content or enact new rules. And that's sort of where we're at now, I would say, right? So we have Itch has relisted free NSFW games, but the policies are still there and they're going to have knock-on effects moving forward.
Why do the payment processors humor this? Why are they so willing to cooperate? Because there has been also pushback, and yet they seem more likely to cooperate with something like Collective Shout.
Yeah, I'm not sure that cooperate is the right word, but yeah, they certainly are instrumentalized by Collective Shout and these other organizations, right? So what like Collective Shout or anti-porn organizations are taking advantage of is the concern that these payment processors have with risk, right? They are framing certain content, pornographic content, as more risky than other content, right? Part of that is like brand management. Part of it is the sort of complexities around the literal payment processing around porn and the financial risks that come along with that. But in either case, it's about risk management. So if you have a company that actually doesn't care about sexual expression, right? The payment processors aren't in the business of ensuring that there's a diversity of sexual expression, right? They're a profit-driven company that is trying to manage their own risk. If they frame pornography as riskier than other content, then the move that they're going to make is to put in place or pressure platforms to put in place rules that minimize that risk for them. The problem is that we live in a culture that already thinks about sex as deeply risky, right? As dangerous, that thinks about it in very sort of black and white, good, bad ways. And so the content that gets wrapped up in that is the content that already comes with this burden around risk and danger, right? So kinky content, queer content, all of that stuff is risky, like in our culture, is deemed risky already. So that when payment platforms go to put in place rules or again, pressure platforms to put in place rules around risk, they just end up reproducing this sort of normative set of ideas around what sex is good and what sex is bad.
I do want to get into the real muck of it, because Collective Shout, what they would say is they are a feminist organization that is trying to protect women and the portrayal of women, and that they are simply trying to prohibit the depiction of rape and sexual abuse. And this is actually a good place where if you could catch people up on what the game is that was the original target.
Yeah. So No Mercy is a game that features incest and rape themes. I think that's fair to say. And this is where it gets complicated, right, in terms of talking about these things. And I think it is good to get into the muck of it because, again, talking to people about these games, they often frame them as like the most explicit or the most extreme content, right? We don't really want to grapple with these themes in pornography, I think. And I think we really have to.
I guess that is the rub, is if we're taking everybody at their word here, that the desire is to just prohibit games with rape in them and sexual abuse. Why is there a desire to push back against that?
Yeah. How do I defend rape games? Yeah. I mean, it's an uncomfortable position to be in, but it's true. Collective Shout does frame itself as a feminist organization. I am also a feminist, right? So we are on different sides of this issue. So what is going on there is part of it, right? And I think I'd answer that in two ways. One is that we are continuing in some ways the long history of feminists disagreeing about pornography. So we have this historical moment that we often call the feminist sex wars. That was a period of really intense debate around the meaning and value of porn and BDSM and other sort of related things. But I think it's hard to understate how raw those debates still feel for some folks within feminism. And they were never really resolved in ways that are maybe satisfying, right? In other words, these debates continue. And those debates, again, are so central to obscenity law because feminists involved in debates around pornography were central in shaping obscenity law in Canada and the United States. So Catherine McKinnon being an important touch point there, but also in shaping the way we think about pornography culturally. And so we're both, like, the folks who agree with Collective Shout and the folks who don't are both feminists. And we're, again, having this debate that we've been having for a long time. And so I think that's important to acknowledge. The other thing, why defend these games? I think for me, there's a real danger in saying we want a diversity of sexual expression, but we can just slide over games like No Mercy or games that upset us or games that engage with taboo and violent themes. And what I would say to that is that I think on the anti-pornography side, there is a tendency to read those games in a really literalist way, right? So to say games about rape, games about incest are going to produce those things in the world. Right? That tends to be the argument, that they're a real reflection of misogyny, and that not only that they're a reflection, but they produce an outcome. So I don't deny that's, for some folks, that could certainly be part of it, right? But I think what porn scholars have been doing for the last several decades is to nuance some of that. And so we can start to dig into or think about that game in a lot of different ways. My colleague, Maggie McDonald, who's at the University of Toronto, has a great little video about incest themes on Pornhub and the fact that part of this is just clickbait. It's about driving views to these games or to these videos. It might not have any deeper cultural force than this is controversial or clickbaity and therefore my video will be downloaded, right? Which I will say, I'm going to forget the developer's name, but this person has really, I'm sure, they have sold more copies of this game than they ever imagined because of this controversy. So we could think about it like that, as clickbaity and about the sort of algorithmic incentives of platforms. If you want downloads, you make something like this. But I think we can also then dig into the piece that's, okay, why are people interested in playing with violence? Why are people interested in playing with these power dynamics? What is at work there? So it might be less about literal playing through or power fantasy than it is about thinking about sex as a way of working through or thinking about power in family structures, or thinking about powerfulness or powerlessness, right, within sex. I was thinking this morning, this is a book called Macho Sluts by Patrick Califia, which was really central to the legal fights around obscenity in Canada and the United States. So this book is a piece of sort of feminist BDSM pornography. It was stopped at the Canadian border. And in the introduction, he writes, quote, "No erotic act has intrinsic meaning. A particular sexual activity may symbolize one thing in majority culture, another thing to members of a sexual subculture." And so that's what it comes down to for me, is like even a game like No Mercy. And I hate to be in the position of defending it, let's say. I don't really hate it that much, but like it's uncomfortable to have to be the one doing it. But like even a game like No Mercy, we need to sort of recognize that it's complicated.
So to push just a little further, it's easy for me as someone who's been in the game space for a very long time to see why and how the slippery slope effect happens. Earlier, you mentioned a list of things that they shouldn't be in games. And you mentioned sexual violence and anything with the animals, which at first, I'm sure many listeners right now are hearing that and being like, seems pretty rational. And then I would say, okay, so anything with furries is now out the door. And the game that you just talked about earlier by Robert Yang is also out the door. Guns for penises. So obviously side effects. Is there a threshold though, where it's like there are barriers, where it's like, oh, even the full free speech advocate does say these are the kind of areas where we agree on things?
Yeah, I think that's the point, right? Is so when we think about this stuff, all of these rules feel like rational person couldn't disagree with them, right? And then exactly as you say, you come in and you say, okay, so furry content, which is, there's a lot of it, right? On Itch, especially, like it's everywhere. So that's a lot of stuff made often by queer folks too. So that's a lot of stuff. Again, my colleague Val Weber has shown that in the context of camming platforms, prohibitions against non-consensual content have meant that content like hypnosis, kink content comes down, content around vampires comes down because of thrall. Like, you know, it gets very, again, these things they balloon out in ways that we don't really anticipate. Okay, so in terms of, is there a line? I'm not going to give you mine because that's part of what's going on here. Is I think that what needs to happen in terms of determining where that line is some amount of transparency, some amount of community engagement, some amount of thinking about these things as values or as things we determine in community, not things that platforms and payment processors are determining. So like it's a really complicated question.
Why does a platform like itch.io struggle with all of this? Why can it not put up these games? And yet why did Steam just release another game that has depicted themes that would certainly come up against rape or sexual assault?
Yeah. I mean, there's been so much like discourse about this, right? And folks feel feelings about how these platforms have navigated this situation. I think what I would say first off is that it is really complicated for them. And it's hard for Itch because Itch is small, right? And because payment processors have giant amounts of power, right? If you say no to them and you do your own thing, well, all of a sudden you can't take any payments. So like that, or you go to the payment processors that will process payments around sexual content, which often they take a much higher cut, right? So it becomes a burden financially for these platforms. They're between a rock and a hard place, really, both of them. Steam just happens to have also more power, and I think can navigate that in different ways. Again, I would love it if they would talk to me about these things, but I expect part of it is that they have a team of lawyers through this stuff, whereas Itch may not. The other thing is, I think, like you said earlier, is that to a certain degree, this was inevitable. I think part of the way people are feeling is that, again, in 2018 with Sesta Fosta and the deplatforming of sex across the internet, like that might have been the time to start thinking about this stuff. Maybe they were. Again, I don't know. They don't tend to talk to us about how they're thinking. But yeah, that sort of raises those concerns. I think, too, like when we think about just like the power, the cultural, financial power of platforms in relation to workers and to like porn and sex workers right now, like I think this really does highlight the importance of working with those workers to think through responses in these ways, which is a lesson that we sort of learn over and over, is that sex workers, porn workers, really know this stuff and have been advocating and screaming about it for like years. And then when shit hits the fan, it's like, well, there would have been ways if we had actually listened to porn and sex workers to sort of head off some of these concerns.
So I'm going to take a quick break, but how about when we come back, I would love to hear more about the bigger picture of all of this and where things might be going from here. Okay, we are back. Historically speaking, where else is this happening? Is this something that is decades in the making? Is this something that is like a relatively new phenomenon with the internet?
It's a long phenomenon. And I guess I think I bring us back to thinking about the feminist sex wars and like debates around pornography, right? And so I think to fully understand or contextualize this moment, we have to think about it in relation to like those long media histories. Something that's funny about both game studies and maybe the games industry in general is that we, as scholars, for a long time sort of had our elbows up a little bit around our field. We wanted to be different than other academic fields. And I think the legacy of some of that is we tend to be siloed in some important ways. And I think that sort of comes through in some of these conversations, which is that, again, like deplatforming, the governance of obscenity is something that we need to think about in relation to law. We need to think in relation to film, comics, like all these other sets of media that have been dealing with this for a very long time. I think for me, in relation to games, the one important way of thinking about this is the legal piece. As you talked about in your earlier episode, we often frame the history of self-regulation as a way of avoiding formal legal regulation, right? The ESRB, for example, was successful in avoiding formal government regulation, right? Like formal law, and that was sort of a success in terms of the self-governance. But I think what we often miss in that is the ways in which those modes of self-regulation, like the ESRB, actually, again, reproduce formal laws, sex exceptionalism. And when I say sex exceptionalism, I mean this idea that sex is without value, that it has no value, no expressive value, and that, again, it is exceptionally risky in some ways. And so that history or that underlying ideology is not unique to games. It's, again, been something that all these other mediums have dealt with in their own ways through film codes and the way that Canadian Border Services at a certain time was pulling content that it deemed obscene that was like generally queer content, right? These are all long histories.
I'll just build into that with some context on my end, because you mentioned how unusual it is that Steam opened up access, that it seemed to allow more pornography when everybody else was battening down the hatches. What I saw on my end in the journalism world, which is strange, is the ESRB was extremely effective at doing what you said when games were brick and mortar, because a game had to get an ESRB rating to be sold, and on top of that, you had to follow their marketing policies. So when I, even in the early 2010s, would publish a trailer for Mortal Kombat, the PR would say, hey, if you want to host this, you need to have an age gate on it, because we need to follow ESRB restrictions. And around the time that we're talking about, mid-2010s, basically everybody gives up, because so much is being sold online, so much is not having to be rated anymore by the ESRB, and it's like, well, we had a good go. And the ESRB has become, outside of AAA games, nothing in terms of creating of self-accountability, which on one hand allows for all of these things, but it feels, as just hearing you say it, we're back to the mid-90s, where it is kind of free range in terms of whatever you want to put out there, you can put out there. You don't really have to deal with the ratings board. Yeah, I don't know. Just I'm realizing as you were saying that, like, how strange that is.
I mean, it's about shifting power dynamics in the media landscape, right? The ESRB's power is waning. Like, it has waned is probably, like you're saying, it doesn't have a huge amount of force anymore outside of AAA. So then where does the power go, or how does the power operate?
I was going to say, Is that part of what we're seeing? Is without an ESRB, without a standard rating system, platforms are having to do it individually, and they're just not adapted for this whatsoever, or haven't prepared for it?
Yeah, I think I definitely think that's part of the dynamic. And like, this isn't unique to games. We're seeing this in like platforms increasingly are the sort of regulatory bodies. We could talk about Facebook or Meta, right? And the way in which the whole mechanism of moderation and governance and all of this is happening within the platform itself. And they've produced all kinds of sort of mechanisms to do that, many of which are often insufficient, right? Especially when you think about cross-cultural or global dynamics. So yeah, we're seeing platforms on our internet right now, which is highly centralized around these platforms as nodes. They have huge governance power in the same way that brick and mortar stores alongside the ESRB used to have.
Yeah. Knowing that this is not a new thing per se, right now I'm thinking of the MPAA with film and the fact that the MPAA can't rate pornography that is on the internet, let alone all of YouTube. Having seen where it's gone with other platforms, where do you see games going? Because it feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're in a little bit of a stalemate with this problem right now.
Yeah, we are. I think that's right. And again, we're seeing sort of these histories repeat themselves in some interesting ways. So I don't know where we go next. I think I would identify a couple dynamics, though, that are happening. First, I think it's important to recognize that developers of sexual content in relation to pornographers and sex workers are drawing attention to this as a problem, right? And that's unsurprising. Like, sex workers have been doing the work of banging this drum, again, for decades and pointing to the ways in which failing to address sex exceptionalism and the way it manifests in formal and informal law is going to result in this less vibrant sexual culture, but also in real material harms for workers, right? I think it's important for us to frame these people as workers, right? And so allowing these platforms to continue on in the way they are will affect people's ability to live and to make money and to make their livelihood. Anyway, so there's action happening. People are fighting back against this. I think we'll have to see how that goes. There's folks here in Canada who are circulating a petition, for example, that if it gets so many signatures, will be delivered or presented to the House of Commons, and they'll have to table a response that who knows where it will go from there, if anywhere. So people are, it seems like there is more mainstream movement maybe from folks who might not have gotten on the bandwagon to like defend sex work and porn, but do feel strongly about games. So there's interesting dynamics happening there. And so we'll just have to see how those actions go, I think, partially. In terms of where this stuff goes, we also have to think about it in the context of like the current political moment where we are seeing these really complicated relationships between conservative politics, feminist organizations, and Christian movements that are like bubbling up into this soup of anti-sex, anti-queer political action. We should also think about the way that what's happening with Steam and Itch right now connects to something like Project 2025, right? Which explicitly calls for, well, it does two things. It explicitly calls for like the incarceration of pornographers. It equates all porn or people who make porn with child abusers. And then it also does this thing where the definition of porn becomes very slippery. And they say that pornography is about quote unquote transgender ideology and all this kind of stuff. So again, the existence of queer people, of trans people becomes pornographic in and of itself. And that definition expands and expands.
I want to push into that just a little bit more before we wrap, because I think that is the big fear that I hear from a lot of listeners and I see from a lot of people who enjoy games, and especially queer and trans listeners, is that is the real slippery slope. That is where this is all heading. Why do people fear that? And I realize I'm kind of asking what might seem like an obvious question, but I think it's worth talking through.
So why do people fear that that dynamic?
Why do people fear? I'm gonna put on my collective shout or my other side hat or whatever here and say, why are you so worried? We're just here to get rid of rape or sexual assault in film and TV. Why do queer, trans, any people feel concerned that this is the beginning of something far more expansive.
Yeah. Because those are the folks who have been historically thrown under the bus and criminalized, right? It's not new, it's a return to something. And I think this is why it's important to defend the uncomfortable games, right? When we think about these games using a kink lens, it's folks who are kinky have long been thrown under the bus, have long been criminalized in various ways, have long had their sort of sexual experiences ignored or punished. And so I think if you're familiar with this history, when you think about the vitriol with which people are coming after pornography and equating folks who produce or work in or consume pornography with like child abusers, if you're familiar with that long history, I think it's really hard to not be scared of it because there's a lot of power behind that discourse and that rhetoric. And I think we're seeing its impacts. But the other thing, too, in relation to all of this, I think, is to say there's value in defending sex and sexual expression for its own sake. That stuff matters. And it matters not only if it's queer, it matters for everyone. Like having a diversity of sexual expression matters. And I think sometimes that gets lost. We want it to mean something more. But I do think that sexual expression for folks matters. And maybe that's where I'm at, but I don't know. Does that sort of answer your question?
100%. I'm sure many people listen to this and are feeling bummed out in the way that when you talk about anything political right now, you can feel bummed out, especially if you skew progressive. Is there anything happening where you feel some confidence or you're seeing progress? Even if you just look back at the arc of history, you find some relief. Is there anything that people can turn towards here and build on?
Oh, lots of stuff. I'm constantly like humbled and amazed by and inspired by the work that sex workers are doing, right? I think, there are folks who have continue to do this really hard work in the face of huge challenges and setbacks, right? Like in relation to Canada, we could think about the way sex work laws after a case called Bedford re-entrenched some harmful modes of governance. All of which is to say, like, there are folks who have been fighting this fight for a long time, who continue to fight this fight and will continue to fight this fight. And so while it's a depressing moment, I think working in solidarity with folks is hugely important now across all of these issues that are coming up. But I think for folks in video games who are feeling or who are running into this issue of deplatforming for the first time through video games, I think I would encourage them to look into the history of sex worker organizing and to think about how you can act in solidarity with those folks. Because I think that, again, like we've said, these are conversations and lessons we learn over and over from those folks. The other thing I would say is, I don't know, if you're feeling bummed out about porn and video games, go make some porn and video games. We live in a time where you can use all types of beginner-friendly tools to make games. And if you are worried about sexual expression being squeezed and deplatformed and that your desires won't have a place online, go make a video game about it and put it out into the world. I think that's also an important action people can take. And then I think on the research side, I just got a grant from the Canadian government to study this, to study specifically Steam and Itch and platform governance, right? So cool stuff is happening. Game studies scholars across the world have been and are increasingly studying sex in games. And there's hopefully lots more sort of knowledge and a bigger contribution academia can make to that space as well. Similarly, in the media, I think if you're in the games media, this has been a heartening sort of bump in the sex and games coverage, but it hasn't always been there. And so it would be nice to see folks in the games media, again, taking these things seriously, taking sex and games seriously, and supporting the folks who have been doing that work for a long time, thinking about how to sort of continue this coverage on past the sort of moment of crisis and to think about, again, the labor, the work, the creative aspects that go into this stuff.
Thank you so much for chatting. This was an absolute delight.
Thanks for having me. I hope I answered all your questions. I do have the academic tendency to ramble, but let me know if you need anything else.
You are the second person in 2 weeks to say I have that tendency as an academic, and neither of you rambled, which is, good. I think it's great. I appreciate it. Hey, a quick split for Patreon subscribers. I have a bit more of this interview for you, including some great not safe for work game recs that are, let's say, a little bit more intellectual than they are pornographical? Is that a word? I don't think it is. For everybody else, we still have the news of the week, so let's get to that. Act 3, the news of the week. We just witnessed the greatest 3-day release window of video games ever. I'm serious. Let's just check the notes. Between September 23rd and 25th, the following titles debuted: Hades 2, Silent Hill F, Consume Me, Sonic Racing, Blippo Plus, Baby Steps, and EA Sports FC 26, formerly known as FIFA. Now, let's give each of these their moment. Hades 2 is the sequel to the winner of dozens of Game of the Year awards. Silent Hill F is the first new mainline entry in the beloved horror series in over a decade. Consume Me won this year's Independent Games Festival's grand prize. Scoff if you must at the next one, but Sonic kart racing games have been nipping at the heels of Mario Kart for a while now, and this latest entry received, from some outlets, better review scores than Mario Kart World. Blippo Plus is a throwback to FMV, or full motion video games, made by a rock band in the Los Angeles underground art scene, and Baby Steps is the follow-up to QWOP, Getting Over It, and Ape Out, 3 indie game masterpieces. Unsurprisingly here, Baby Steps is also exceptional, and I'm not even really getting into EA's soccer game, which continues to be one of the best-selling franchises on the planet, one largely responsible for continuing to keep the lights on at Electronic Arts' offices. If you include lesser-known but still excellent and/or interesting games, you could add Tokyo Extreme Racer, a beautiful revival of Sega Dreamcast-era arcade racing, and a remake of Pac-Man World, the cult classic that turns Pac-Man into a Mario-style 3D platformer. I didn't know we needed a remake of it, but we sure got one. And if you expand the window from 3 days to 2 weeks, you also get Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles, which is apparently a killer remake of one of the greatest tactics games that hits on September 3rd. On October 2nd, Ghost of Yotei, Sony's big quadruple A release for the season. And also on October 2nd, Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 on Switch. Whew! Things do slow down a little bit after this. You only get like 1 or 2 great games a week, which is real good because I will need months to catch up. I will add also selfishly here, I personally feel targeted in the best way. For post games, we have covered the behind the scenes stories of 2 of these games, Consume Me and Blippo, and 2 of these games, Consume Me and Baby Steps, were created in part by former students of my Intro to Games Journalism 101 course. Am I saying that I have any hand in that success? No, absolutely not. But am I using this as an opportunity to promote the Patreon, where you can take a version of that Intro to Games Journalism 101 course for like $5 a month, which is so much cheaper than college tuition. And who knows, maybe you'll take it and somehow be inspired to make a wonderful game too. Not drawing any connection between the two, just putting it out there. One other thing before we wrap. The annual Tokyo Game Show took place this week in this colossal convention center, but the most exciting thing to happen was actually outside those walls. Hideo Kojima, celebrating the anniversary of Kojima Productions, revealed a whole bunch of stuff, including like a snippet of the anime version of Death Stranding. It looks okay. But most importantly, they showed OD. Not the dog from Garfield, but the not legally continuation of PT, one of the greatest horror experiences of all time. Now, if you aren't familiar with PT, basically what happened was Kojima, when he was working at Konami, was planning some sort of reboot or remake of Silent Hill, and PT was this demo that you could play that was so good and so influential that despite it being a demo, it made it onto Game of the Year lists at the end of the year. It was one of my 5 favorite games the year it came out. And yet, you basically can't play it anymore because the game that PT would become got canceled. So the demo got taken down, and now there's no place to officially play it. Like, you can't go buy it at a store, you can't download it on a storefront. OD being made means we get to finally get a taste of that PT magic again. We also get to see whatever the main idea was for a full-length game. It is really, really, really exciting for really, really, really old video game dorks. If you like modern horror games, no matter what your age is, you have played something influenced by this entire miasma. It's cool. And, I always like to end on some good news. And that is the news of the week. A very special Patreon bonus. I went to Sega's headquarters this week, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I saw, what it's like going there, the whole shebang. You know how this goes. This is where we split up. If you are a Patreon subscriber, or you would like to be, you could go to patreon.com/postgames and subscribe for $5 a month. We will go right into this segment about Sega and Yakuza and all sorts of cool stuff. And if not, totally cool too. Let's wrap things up. The sexy video game revolution will continue to be televised. For now, next week, a hybrid episode. First, solving Nintendo's mysteries. The home of Mario is notorious for its secretive approach to game development, offering very few interviews. But I've seen a few things, so I'll be sharing what I've learned over the years by answering listener-submitted voice questions. If you have a cue about Nintendo or modern video games, please send a 2-minute or less voice note to postgamesmailbag@gmail.com. Also, next week, a final piece of the Not Safe for Work video game trilogy. We've met a lewd game maker, we've heard from a respected academic about pornographic video games, and the push to censor them, and next week, I'll introduce you to a YouTube creator who makes videos about not safe for work video games without upsetting the YouTube algorithmic gods. It is an incredible feat that requires a lot of code words and some real careful steps. Let me be clear, this isn't the core topic of the show, but like my coverage of AI early on, I found more stories to tell here than I could fit into a single episode. So I wanted to make sure you heard it. But for now, I begin my farewell. A reminder, post-game supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern. They get extra acts and bonus materials. This week, Patreon listeners got not safe for work game recommendations from somebody who really knows, along with a little bit of Gooner discourse, and an update on what I saw this week at the Sega headquarters, including a game that, let's be real, probably one of my most anticipated of next year, knowing my taste. Each month, Patreon subscribers also get a video in my ongoing series, Video Game Journalism 101, and everything is ad-free. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free at post.games. We have Postgames logo by the best James Barham. We have that oh-so-sweet theme by Mark Sparling, and a special thank you to this week's guest, Gene Ketterling. If you like the show, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or share the show with a friend. If you happen to be watching this little experiment of an episode on YouTube, let me know in the comments if this is what you'd like more of. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week.